This episode of Scandal Water contains adult themes and descriptions of violence. It is not intended for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
and Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Ashley.
Hello.
If you're looking at us right now and we're smiling at each other, it's because it looks like the beginning of the episode to you guys, but we actually just finished. Let us fill you in. Okay, we mentioned this in our update episode last week, but we did an episode back in September on Bitter Blood, and it has really resonated with our listeners. It is our number one downloaded episode of all time, and over on YouTube, because we do upload all of our episodes there as well, it is our number one audio only podcast on YouTube as well. The number one video is our interview with Hannah from Chili Bee ASMR, if you want to go check that one out. But the point is, very high interest. We wanted to follow up. We wanted to do more with this because you guys have really, really been just drawn into it the same way that we were. As I said last week, I reached out to my friend Tammy. She is the niece of Mr. Lynn Nobles, who Ashley and I thought had a significant but more focused, more narrow role in this investigation. And boy, were we wrong. This man was in it all.
He was integral.
He was in it the whole time. You're about to hear him share with you, as he shared with us, his entire experience and so many interesting points.
I'm going to say that he's going to give some information that's brand new. Well, brand new to people who listen to our podcast. And he's going to clarify a few things. And there's a couple pieces of information that I was personally kind of shocked by, considering the story. If you could be even more shocked, I was.
100%. This is absolutely fascinating. We can't wait to share this with you. So without further ado, here's Mr. Lynn Nobles. We are so excited to have you here with us today, Mr. Nobles. I'm going to call you Lynn, if that's all right.
Yes, that's fine.
For our listeners, you know, a lot of times we will send questions in advance, but Mr. Nobles Lynn is just going to answer these off the top of his head. We are just going to be hitting him with lots of different questions. We cannot wait to see where this goes. So again, thank you for talking with us. And here's our first question. In his book, Bitter Blood, Jerry Bledsoe explains that you were a very new detective when you had just been promoted, and you were a very new detective when you were assigned to go to the murder site where Delores and Janie Lynch had been murdered. Ashley is very good at noticing dates, and she realized that today, as we are talking to you, is the 40th anniversary of the day you were called to that murder site, which just kind of gave us both chills. But we wanted to ask you, what are some of your strongest recollections of that day, of that experience?
Now, I had been a police officer for several years prior to this, so I had been to many murder scenes, death scenes, but this was the first one that I ever took on. It was a bit confusing because we had an elderly woman found laying in the driveway, and obviously she had been there for a couple of days. We weren't aware at the time that there was a second person involved, which was her daughter, Janie. As we went through the house, we found her in the back sunroom. Like, I think Delores called that the Florida room. Mm-hmm. That put a whole new level. Now we have 2 women killed. The biggest impression I got was that it wasn't some random shooting, because when you have what's called a double tap signature kill, it elevates it to a different level. We're not dealing with some random thug that broke into the house, got caught, and then shot somebody on his way out. This is a woman that was shot once in the back and once in the head. the back to incapacitate her, the shot in the head to make sure she's down. I thought to myself, boy, I'm going to need some help on this. So that was my initial response.
Because I'm guessing those types of crimes, those types of murders don't happen in little Oldham County, especially back in the 1980s. Is that correct?
No, Oldham County was still fairly rural. The Oldham County Police Department was fairly new. I think I was the ninth or 10th officer hired onto the department. That's how new it was.
Wow.
And so our chief decided that we needed help from the Kentucky State Police. And he contacted Lieutenant Dan Davison, who was head of detectives for the post. And I literally was assigned to work with the state police for a little over a year. And I worked under Dan Davison's direction. And I worked, my partner was Sherman Childers. And we worked at this case every day.
Wow.
I was wondering, as Candy was telling this story, to me, it just kept sounding more and more bizarre. Like, there would just be things that would happen, and it just seemed like this is just too wild to even be true. So I wanted to know, as a person who might have been used to dealing in black and white facts, how did it make you feel as you're investigating this? How did you feel about this bizarre, each bizarre new thing? What was your feelings or your gut feelings as this was proceeding?
Our thing was finding the motive. We had to figure out what the motive
Right.
was. And you know, you go about these things in a process of elimination. And having two women murdered, the house, when we went in and we were looking inside the home, some jewelry boxes were turned over, just spilled out on the bed. Some drawers were pulled open. It looked staged.
Mm-hmm.
It did not look like it was a burglary and the burglar was interrupted. The precision of the killing was too accurate. So we're wondering, why would a hit be put on these women?
Mm-hmm.
And Sherman and I spent a great part of our time interviewing the entire graduating cast of the dental school for the University of
Oh
Louisville.
yeah.
You know, doing background on Janie, thinking somebody had a vengeful motive towards
Mm-hmm.
her. Delores was well known in the community. Didn't find anyone that truly hated the woman. She had some oddities about her, but the other thing we did, we set up roadblocks on Highway 329 and on Sleepy Hollow Road. And at the times of the morning that we believe the murder occurred, and we lucked out and we found this man who was a professional bicyclist.
Oh.
And he ran the course of Highway 329 going north towards or south towards Crestwood. And then at Sleepy Hollow Road, he then rode down into Sleepy Hollow up into Jefferson County. And he knew his times everywhere he was along that route. So he knew exactly where he was and what time it was when he heard the first gunshots.
Ooh.
So we were able to go back to the exact day and the exact time that the shots put Delores down in the driveway.
Wow.
The other thing we did, we had another person who frequented Highway 329, and they saw a unusual black Chevy Blazer that they'd never seen before, and they were describing it. It had a big steel bumper on the front. And back in that day, the Chevy Blazers, not like the ones we see today, they were full size, almost full size trucks.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the guys, to make them off road, they would weld these big steel pipes on the front of them. And this guy remembers that bumper and he remembers that it was white. But he'd never seen that truck in that area before. And it was slowly just going up and down Highway 329. But he didn't get a license plate. He couldn't tell us if it was, you know, Kentucky or any other state. He just remembered that black Blazer. So we have a vehicle that's suspicious in the area, and we have the exact time of death. We still don't have any idea of the motive. We actually recover bullets. I recovered one from the door frame where Delores was shot in the head. A second bullet was recovered that we could use for identification of a weapon, was recovered from Janie back in the Florida room. But those sat in the lab for over a year because we still didn't have a suspect.
Well, when you mention a suspect, of course, we as readers reading about this case, we had the benefit of the big picture. We knew Tom Lynch was innocent, and we had a lot of sympathy for him. But I'm sure, as the detective investigating this case, he was a big suspect for you in the beginning, and we wanted to know your impressions of him as you were working this investigation.
The immediate surviving family member is always a suspect. He lived in Arizona. We contacted the police in Arizona that made contact with him. He immediately contacted the Kentucky State Police. Lieutenant Davison talked to him. We made arrangements for him to fly into Kentucky. Sherman and I picked him up at the airport. My impression of him was a very sad man, broken, very demure in his presence. He was a sad sack. And we did a very extensive interview with him. I took him down. Sherman and I took him to the Jefferson County Police Department, and we had him polygraphed. He was so upset that he failed the polygraph. Actually, he didn't fail it. It was inconclusive. So we brought him back and we re-interviewed him again over all the questions on the polygraph and why he thought he would have failed it. And he said, I'm just tore up. And anybody could understand that. His mother and sister were just murdered. So we made arrangements for a second polygraph, and this time I took him to a different polygraph examiner. I took him up to northern Kentucky to the state police post there, and we ran a second polygraph, which he passed with no problem. And I got to spend a lot of time with him in that travel all the way up to Covington and back, and he kind of loosened up and was talking about his life. I didn't think he was involved. I brought him back, explained the results to Lieutenant Davison. We sat down, talked to him again, and then we sent him back to his hotel. And Dan and Sherman and I were talking, and we all three came to the conclusion that he wasn't involved. So now we don't have a suspect. And Sherman and I continue to interview anyone and everyone. We had people claiming to pull this murder off.
Really?
And of course, that's your time. And you have to go out and investigate them, and you have to prove that they're not involved because you can't leave any stone unturned. And that took time. A couple of them we got involved back. If you probably don't, but back then we had the Cuban boat flotillas, and Cuban refugees were brought in by the Catholic charities all over the United States. I would say a couple hundred of them landed in Louisville under Catholic charities, and they got involved in burglary. And so we were having tack rooms around. You're in horse country where Delores and Janie lived. And so we had tack room burglaries. Tack rooms, of course, are where the saddles and the bridles and everything are kept for the horses. And some of those saddles are custom made, very expensive, and they were being stolen. So we pulled in the Louisville Intelligence Unit to help us track down these Cuban suspects, which we were able to do. And even went to flea markets and bought a lot of the stolen tack back. That took up a lot of time because they're in the area. The big horse farm on the hill right behind Delores was one of the burglary sites. So we have to follow that through. We were able to make an arrest on this Cuban ring and bust it up, but they weren't involved. That took a lot of time. I had another juvenile that had been terrorizing eastern side of Louisville in the East End. I can't remember the name of his little gang that he tried to create. And they would do home invasions where they would get into your home and rearrange your furniture just to let you know that you're vulnerable. And they were doing it to these big expensive homes in the East End. And well, Jefferson County burglary unit finally caught up with him. The kid was like 16 years old, and he was sent away to a youth camp, but he escaped, made his way back to Louisville, then bragged about the Lynch murders. So there we get drugged back into that again. And I was able to disprove that he wasn't involved. Just the timelines of his escape and trying to get back to Louisville in the time when Delores and Jane were murdered, it just didn't match up. And we knew that it was just bravado. But again, that led us down another path, took us off.
Wow. I can hear, listening to you explain this, it makes me realize just what a huge job this is and how many different false leads you have to follow that end up taking so much time and energy. And of course, we know ultimately it's going to lead you to North Carolina. But a quick follow-up question that this may jump in our timeline a little bit, but you personally got to talk with Tom Lynch and interview him. Did you end up personally interviewing or speaking with one-on-one any of the other key players in this murder case, the Newsomes or the Klenners, or?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
It's a much more complex story.
Okay.
One of the things we discovered when we were the search warrant on Dolores's house is Sherman and I discovered the divorce papers,
Mhm.
not really attaching a lot of credit to it. I mean, people go through divorces, but we had the papers. We questioned Tom about that. And this was a college sweetheart that he had married. They had divorced. It had been a pretty bitter divorce. There'd been a lot of custody battles back and forth between Tom and Susie. And Tom was trying to start his dental practice, and Delores was footing the bill for the legal bills, which infuriated Susie. None of that was given to us. None of that was provided by Tom. Not that he was hiding anything. This man was so, I almost call it ambivalent. He just didn't, he didn't have the ability to attach evilness to Susie. He just couldn't do it.
Wow.
And when Susie was living in Arizona, one of his little boys was literally showing up with unusual bruises on him, and human resources were investigating her for child abuse. Tom just couldn't believe she could do it, and basically called the kid a liar. And his benign behavior towards her really hindered us because we didn't key and focus on her. We had Kentucky is there is a national intelligence organization involving police departments all across the country, and we reciprocate on giving information. Tom did tell us about Susie was now living with her cousin. He was mad at the cousin because he was this type of survivalist kind of guy, wannabe doctor, was providing all of these vitamins. And what Tom was upset about was the volume of vitamins the kids were taking was causing calcification on the kids' teeth.
Okay.
And every time Tom got the kids, he had to do a dental clean. That was his big concern. Not that the guy was surrounding the boys with weapons and everything else.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it was impossible for him to see her in any different light?
That was just his nature. He just didn't see the bad in people. He didn't see it.
So it would have been anyone, not just her. He couldn't see that anyone could be bad.
Yeah, it was just his nature. He was just, like I said, almost to the point of ambivalence. And had he been more forthcoming with us, we would have keyed on Susie much sooner.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very important that I go back to the intelligence. We contacted the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation and asked them if they had any intelligence on Susie or Fritz Klenner, and we were told no, they had nothing in their intelligence. So they had no criminal history, no criminal background, nothing. So, we're still following up on our leads here. We had been at this for about 6 months, 6 to 8 months, interviewing everybody we could think of. And I went down to Louisville Homicide Bureau. I had a good friend there, Lieutenant Swanky, been with homicide for many years with Louisville. There was a time when Louisville Metro Police, before they were Metro Police, they were a crack police department, but their homicide unit was one of the best around.
Mm.
And I was talking to Lieutenant Swanky, and we're going over the case. I had submitted all my evidence to the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, trying to get a psychological profile on the killer. That came back negative. They said they couldn't develop a profile. Swanky and I were talking, and he looked at me and he goes, "You know what, Lynn?" He says, "You got a dark cloud in that family." He said, "You find the dark cloud, you find your killer."
Mm, that's interesting.
That's when we started turning our sights back towards North Carolina. And it wasn't long after my conversation with Swanky. Of course, I went back, I talked with Lieutenant Davison and Sherman, and I'm explaining to them what I was told and the advice I was given. And Dan says, "Well, I have to agree." We made a second request to the intelligence unit in North Carolina. Came back blank, nothing. And then almost a year into it, we're getting frustrated because we haven't developed any further leads. We've pretty much interviewed everybody we could interview. And a dispatcher walks back to my office and hands me a teletype. And it's a report of multiple murders in Winston-Salem, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And it involved the relatives of Susie Lynch. And I immediately ran into the lieutenant's office and I said, "We got to go to North Carolina."
I found my dark cloud.
Yeah.
Well, my partner Sherman looked at me and he goes, "Lynn, they were killed with a 45. That doesn't match up with our profile." And I said, "Sherman, you're right, but it's too coincidental that we have more family members dead."
Mm-hmm.
And so Dan tells Sherman and I, "Pack up. You're going to North Carolina." And the Winston-Salem Police Department, the Sheriff's Office was fantastic. They let Sherman and I go right into their homicide unit. and observe everything that they were doing. We were walked back through their crime scene, explained everything that was going on, and were there and participated in everything that they did.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question? As I was reading about this, my impression was that you all came in very shortly before the big police chase happened. But as you're telling it to me, it sounds as though this was more of an ongoing collaboration with this police department. How did that play out?
Well, we immediately. I mean, the teletype came out. That's instant communication. What it does is we did the same thing with the Lynch murders. We send out a teletype across the nation, and then any police department that's had a similar murder scene reports back, and then we see if we can match up information. We had a match up on relatives, not so much as the type of weapon that was used. We knew from the recovered bullets that we had most likely a 223, which would come out of either an AR-15 or a Mini 14. That if it came out of an AR-15, back in those days, AR-15s were very rare. They're basically a knockoff of a military M16, except they're not automatic, and they were expensive back then. You're talking about a $2,000 or $3,000 gun back in the mid '80s. So I remember making the statement to Lieutenant Davis, and I said, that's an expensive gun. If that killer's not going to just throw that gun away like you would a handgun, you would just throw it away. I said, he's not going to throw that gun away. It's too expensive. I said, we find the killer, we're going to find the gun. So no, and we immediately left. Sherman and I went to North Carolina. We introduced ourselves to the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department, and they just brought us right in. And the lieutenant that was leading or I think it was a sergeant, Alan Gentry, that had the lead on the investigation, we just climbed in his car. Everywhere he went, we went. And we were at one point, they were the same as us. They're trying to figure out, they've got 3 people dead, nothing taken in the home, looks like an execution style murder. There was no forced entry into the house. And the link was from the Lynch murders in Kentucky and the murders in North Carolina with Susie Newsom. That was the link. They began to interview family members and everyone, and several people told him it's Fritz Klenner. Fritz did it, but it's speculation. And you can't arrest someone based on speculation. Right. You have to have evidence. And they were smart in that they put it out in the public about the murders. And young boy Ian Perkins began to put 2 and 2 together and realized he was duped, and literally came forward and said, I think I may have been involved in this murder unwittingly.
Oh, interesting.
And so that helped us focus immediately on Fritz Klenner. Immediately.
So how long had you been in North Carolina before it escalated into that car chase?
Just days, just a couple of days.
This was all very fast.
Very fast. Okay. We were closing in. The Forsyth County, Alan Gentry, and I can't remember the SBI agent's name, Sturgill, went to Susie Newsom's apartment, was interviewing Susie. Fritz was actually there, but he had left and gone into a bedroom so they could interview Susie. I can't remember Sturgill's first name, so I'm going to have to call him Sturgill.
Fine.
We're in the conference room back at the sheriff's department, and he said, I could have swore when he closed that door in that bedroom, I heard the action of a bolt, like on the slide on a 45 or a 9mm. Wow. He says, I heard that sound, and so they were on guard from then on, but nothing happened. They interviewed Susie. She was cool, calm, couldn't advise of anything, showed no real sorrow that her family members had been killed. It was just her parents and her grandma. Really showed no remorse or sorrow at all. And they come back. They then focus on Ian Perkins, and he begins to explain his involvement in this. And this kid was so absolutely gullible that he believed everything Fritz Klenner told him. Fritz Klenner was an absolute sociopath and a pathological liar. And I ask people, do you believe monsters walk among us? Well, Fritz Klenner was a monster. And there were several people in that community that were afraid of him and had reported that to the state police, and nothing was ever done. I was relaying in initial meeting, I was relaying to Sturgill and to Alan Gentry that we had made inquiries on Fritz to the North Carolina Bureau of Investigation and asked for any intelligence they had on him or Susie, and we were told there was none. And Sturgill looked at me and he goes, "Well, let me check on that." In the meantime, we have to take the interview with Ian Perkins. We have to go back and backtrack and follow all of his and Fritz's footsteps. Mm-hmm. Because we're looking for a murder weapon, because Ian's claiming that Fritz threw his clothes away and disposed of the barrel to his gun, the thing about a 45 is you can take the barrel out, throw it away, and put a new barrel in it, and then the rifling in it, you can't trace back to the bullet. Oh. But if you have the shell casings, you can match the marks on the shell casing to the ejector on the weapon. They trace all of their travels, how they pretended to be camping up in the mountains, and then their trip down into North Carolina, and how Ian drops Fritz off. He's across the street from the Newsome's house, and then he's instructed to go park in a parking lot and just wait for him. And he didn't hear the shots or anything, but he sees Fritz slowly coming down the street in a car that he didn't recognize, and Fritz is signaling for him to fall in behind him and follow him. So Ian falls in behind him, but as the process of falling in behind him, Fritz was being so methodical and slow that a Greensboro police officer thought that he was drunk driving. So he pulled him over, and Fritz just explained, "No, I'm having car trouble. This darn car won't run. I'm going to have to turn around and take it back." And the officer lets him go. He has no idea there's a murder. Mm-hmm. Fritz isn't drunk. So he lets him go. And Fritz turns around and returns the car back to the Newsome's house, and jumps in the truck with Ian, and then takes off. And so we had to verify all of that. Mm-hmm. And it was decided, Ian agreed to cooperate with us on trying to elicit a confession out of Fritz Klenner. And he agrees to wear a body mic. And we know that this is very dangerous for Ian to do, because had Fritz discovered he had a mic on, there's no doubt in my mind Fritz would have killed him. Mm-hmm. So Sherman and I run out of money and we're running out of clothes, and then we tell him, "Look, don't do anything. We got to go back to Kentucky really fast." So we jump in the car and we race across North Carolina back into Kentucky, and we're getting fresh clothes and we're getting new, money for travel and everything. And Dan Davis and Dan goes, "I'm going with you guys this time. I can't miss this." So Dan jumps in the car, and all three of us head back to North Carolina, and we all meet up, and we're at the conference room at the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department. And I had kind of buddied up to this young SBI agent, State Bureau of Investigation agent, and he tapped me on the shoulder and he goes, "Lynn, can you step out in the hallway, please?" And I said, "Sure." And I walked out in the hallway, and he handed me a folder, and he goes, "Here's that intelligence report they told you we didn't have. Oh. And you're going to be amazed."
What was in it? We have to know.
The fact that people had reported that he was pretending to be a doctor when he wasn't a doctor. He was treating people, that he was buying an excessive amount of firearms, just general.
All of those accounts that had been,
yeah, that he was a survivalist and claimed to be a member of Posse Comitatus and the whole nine yards, which none of it was true, but it doesn't matter. Fritz lived in his own world. And so I'm looking at that folder and I'm going, but I was told twice that you guys didn't have anything on him. And he said, "Yeah, well, there's politics involved, because his family was very prominent in North Carolina. Susie's family was very prominent in North Carolina. And that was hidden." So I get the folder, and he says, "What are you going to do with it?" And I said, "I'm going to give it to my lieutenant." And I said, "Watch the fireworks go off in this conference room." Because the literal director of the State Bureau of Investigation was in there. He was going to coordinate this, because we were going out of the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office's jurisdiction. We were going into Greensboro. And so we had to coordinate through the State Bureau of Investigation in North Carolina. And I called Dan out in the hallway and I said, "Dan, you need to look at something." And I showed him that file, and Dan got mad. And he and the State Bureau investigator had a bit of a discussion. I wasn't present for it. I didn't want to be there. And then we all decided it was time. So we got Ian wired up. In those days, you didn't have these little bitty tiny microphones that you could hide on people. Yeah. You had to literally tape a recording to a recorder
Oh my
to someone. So not only did it record the conversation, it also broadcast it on a radio frequency at the same time.
God.
So you literally, when that's where the word wired up comes from. They were little bitty recorders, and then you had to literally tape a wire up to a microphone up close to where they could talk.
Ugh.
So if someone was to pat you down, they could feel that microphone, they could feel that wire. That's why you see in the old movies when the guys get you wearing a wire and they pat him down. That's what they're looking for. And they don't do that anymore now. We're much more sophisticated. We have the micro recorders and the micro phones and everything. We explain to Ian what we need. We explain to him what he needs to do. So he contacts Fritz. Fritz agrees to meet him. Ian puts on the story that, look, the police are really putting pressure on me and I really don't know what to say. And before I go into this interview, I really need to talk to you so I know what to say. Fritz agrees to meet him. So we all set up in a perimeter around the parking lot, and Ian goes and gets in Fritz's truck. And we know this is a very dangerous moment. If Fritz had patted him down, that would have been the end of it. He didn't. Ian was so nervous that he wouldn't let Fritz talk. He just talked, and every time Fritz tried to say something, Ian cut him off and kept talking. And we got nothing. We got absolutely nothing.
Ooh.
So he finally gets out of the car, out of his truck, walks away, and the handler picks him up. We go back, and we set Ian down in the conference room, and we say, "You got to shut up and let the man talk." But God bless him, he was just absolutely a nervous wreck. I didn't have a lot of sympathy for him, but it took a lot of bravery to go sit back down in that truck.
Mm-hmm.
Now knowing what he knew,
Mm-hmm.
and he was going to try to make it right.
Yeah.
So we set up a second meeting between Ian and Fritz, and this time it's on the premise that Ian's going to have to do a polygraph and all this other stuff, and he just doesn't know what to say. And now we're getting to the point where it really gets interesting, and we send Ian back in. We meet at that same parking lot. Ian gets in the truck after we've wired him up, and this time Fritz won't specifically talk about the murders, but he tells Ian, "I will write a letter exonerating you of any and all involvement in this, and you will never see me again." And Ian gets out of the truck, and before Fritz could drive off, we're on our radios going, "We got to take him now. We can't let him get back to his apartment. He's heavily armed to the hilt. If we don't take him now, we're going to have a war."
Yeah.
This FBI director wouldn't pull the trigger. He goes, "No, I have to get permission from the district attorney's office to arrest him." District attorney's in a trial. Back then, cell phones were virtually unheard of. So we have to literally stop at a phone booth. I'm with a young narcotics detective in a Mustang. I'm in the back seat. My partner Sherman's in the passenger seat with this young narcotics detective, and we're following the Black Blazer, just like what was described by that gentleman a year ago driving down Highway 329. And we're frantic. We're going, "No, we need to take him down. We don't need permission. We've got probable cause. We need to arrest him." But this guy would not pull the trigger. He was the director. He wouldn't pull the trigger. And then finally, Fritz makes it back to the apartment and starts pulling into the parking lot. And he goes, "Okay, it's a go. We can arrest him. The district attorney's approved arrest." And we go, "What are we going to do now? He's in the parking lot. We can't get to him now. He's going into the apartment." So we think he's going to come out and we'll get him when he leaves, because he told Ian he'd never see him again. So we think we'll get him when he leaves. Well, lo and behold, he comes walking out of the apartment. He's carrying long guns, all kinds of bags. Susie comes out. Then the two boys come out. And we think, oh my God, we've got the two boys. Well, this SBI director decides that we're going to take him down in the parking lot, even with the children in the truck, because he believed that if they got to the farm, we'd have to bring in SRT teams, special response teams, and it would be a run and gun battle in that farm. That's what the SBI director believed. My mind's in a different area. We're all detectives. We're in unmarked cars. We're detectives. We're not special response units. Well, we try to put a roadblock up coming out of the apartment building, and he just plows right through it, and that big Blazer just pushes everybody out of the way, and he goes right through it. So he's coming out onto the main highway, and now, mind you, Sherman and I are with this young narcotics detective, and we're supposed to be in the background observing. We're not supposed to be participants in this, but he sees that the last effort to get Fritz to stop, he zips out of the parking lot we're in, and as Fritz is approaching this intersection, he pulls crossways right in front of Fritz's Blazer, and Fritz's truck literally hits passenger side door. And I'm looking right up at him. A Greensboro City police officer pulls up beside Fritz. He was the first uniform car to get there. Fritz literally has his window down and just takes an Uzi machine gun with his left hand and fires it at Greensboro officer's car. The guy was smart. He had on his bulletproof vest, and he stuck his head in the headliner of the car, so one round hit his vest, and one round actually hit the belt buckle on his gun belt. Then he opens his door and steps out on the side rail on the truck, leans over his hood. I'm looking right at him, and he starts unloading that Uzi into our car. And I don't remember how many rounds our car took, but I remember there was this lady, because we were at a red light. This lady, we're sideways in the road, and this poor innocent woman is sitting in her car right next to us,
Oh my God.
facing in traffic, and her expression was just, what in God's green earth? And I kind of chuckled at that. And then I pull my gun and I'm getting ready to return fire. And my partner Sherman, his window had bullet holes through it, but he just took his gun and just busted the window out. And I remember looking at that lady again, and she's going, "Oh my God!" And again, I start chuckling because it was like a Dirty Harry move. And Sherman wheels around and starts shooting back. And at that moment, I didn't know I was shot.
Oh.
I had my gun across my chest, and I'm getting ready to wheel around on him, and I feel just a ping on my gun. I don't feel anything else. You're pumped with adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
And Fritz usually backs up and then rams us and pushes us out of the way and pushes on the intersection. And the detective that I was with, he was a madman. He immediately follows right in behind him, and we're off on, and Fritz is not doing more than 35 miles an hour. Not a high speed chase, 35 miles an hour.
But you've been shot at this point.
No.
Oh, okay.
We make it through the intersection. We're heading out on town, and I feel this grating in my armpit. I feel this grating, and I said, "Sherman, I think I'm shot." And he goes, "Are you all right?" And I remember saying, "I don't know. I've never been shot before. I don't know if I'm all right or not." I said, "Tell me if I got an exit wound." And so I turn around, and Sherman goes, "No, you don't have an exit wound." And I look, and I said, "This is my brand new suit. I just bought this suit. It ruined my suit." And I had taken a round in my armpit, and another one just cut across the top of my shoulder.
Wow.
Grace of God. One round had hit my gun right before my trigger finger, and that's the round that ricocheted into my shoulder, which probably took a lot of the energy out of the gun because it was just lodged just under the skin. And the other round just cut right across the top of me. And
so you've just been shot, and all these rounds have been sprayed across your car, and you guys are still following him, knowing he has this Uzi and can pull it back out at any moment.
It gets better. So we're following him, but we're kind of holding a distance, and we're coming around the blind curve, the first blind curve, and as we come around the curve, Fritz's Blazer is sideways in the road. He's on the back of it, and now he's got a long gun. And now he's got, and I can't remember, I think it was an AK-47. And he starts clapping rounds off at us. And car starts taking rounds again. Then we return fire. When we return fire, Fritz gets back in the truck and takes off again. Well, while we're still pursuing him, the SBI manages to get an airplane in the air over on top of Fritz. So now we got eyes in the sky. The next blind curve, Fritz tries to pull that maneuver again. Well, now we know that he's up there. So we slowly ease up and we're ready. And we immediately jump out and open up on him. The narcotics agent that I was with, I wish I could remember his name, but I can't. He had a Mini 14 in the trunk of his car. We got that out and we're able. Pistols and long guns don't match, We're detectives. We're carrying 9mm. So he jumps out with his Mini 14. He's firing back at Fritz. Fritz takes off again. And about that time, we get this very strong order to drop out of the pursuit because I had been shot. And because the detective asked me, he goes, "Man, do you want to go to the hospital?" And I said, "No, let's get this SOB. I want him. I'm not hurt bad. Let's get him." We pull off. We're literally ordered out of the pursuit. And we have to go to the hospital. I get checked out. Turns out Sherman's got shrapnel and everything in his arm. And so we both get treated at the hospital. Well, while we're en route to the hospital, I'm going to relay to you what Dan Davison relayed to me. Dan's car, the command car, is now the lead car. And Dan says they're on this long rural road, straight stretch. Dan said he saw this furious movement in the truck. And he could see Susie jumping around and everything else. And then the next thing you know, Dan says it looks like Fritz had rolled his window down and he tried to throw something out, but Fritz hadn't rolled his window all the way down. So what he tried to throw out hit the window and bounced back in the truck. And it turns out that was the Claymore mine that he had refurbished himself. And that's what blew the truck up. And Dan said the next thing you know, the truck just exploded. He said, but I saw him do this, slinging motion. And then I saw him really get frantic in the truck. Mm-hmm. And then, because what he had planned on doing was throwing that mine out on the road and taking out the vehicles that were following him. Mm-hmm. Unbeknownst to him, that we had a roadblock up ahead. The North Carolina State Police had set up roadblocks ahead with spike sticks and everything else. And so the truck blew up. Sherman and I get out of the hospital. We race back to the scene, and we're walking through that devastation. And it's just, the truck is just in pieces. Fritz was actually still alive when Dan Davison got to him. Even though he was almost literally blown in half, he was still alive. And Dan tried to talk to him, but all he did was gurgle. And then he passed away. Susie was dead. I think she was literally physically blown in half. The two boys were still in their seat belts in the back seat, but they were deceased. Once the bodies are removed from the scene and the post-op is conducted, we find that the boys had been shot, but they had also been forced to take cyanide. But what the book doesn't say is what I'm going to tell you now is another insider, is that one boy was shot with a 9mm and one boy was shot with a .45. So it is our opinion, and it's mine and Dan and Sherman's opinion and Alan Gentry's opinion, that Fritz spun around and shot the boy directly sitting across from him on the right. Susie spun around and shot her son with her 9mm after they had taken the cyanide. So we then began to do more interviews, and now we're back in North Carolina again because we have a lot of follow-up. What Dan and Sherman and I are hunting now, we're trying to find that weapon. Go ahead.
I can ask a quick question about that chase. I believe this was a detail in the book, but it might not be accurate, or I may be misremembering. Did you actually make eye contact or see Susie's face as Fritz was firing at you?
Yeah, she was as calm as she could be. She was sitting there looking at you just like I'm looking at you. Mm-hmm. Expressionless.
Just impassive. Totally impassive.
Yes. No shock and all, nothing.
Why do you think that was? What is your opinion of her? You've said your opinion of Fritz, so he was a monster and a sociopath. What do you think of her?
I will tell you that in my experience, and one of the great things I got to do as a detective, I got to go to the FBI's psychological profiling school. Dysfunctional people tend to attract dysfunctional people.
It's normal for them.
To live in a world of chaos is normal for them. They surround themselves with chaos. So another day on the job for Susie. I believe she was going down a deep psychosis, I guess is the best way to describe it. She had, I'd say, virtually lost touch with reality. She was living in this conspiratorial world. Fritz had her convinced that people were trying to kill her. Fritz had her convinced he was a CIA operative and he did secret missions and people were coming for him. He even staged some incidents with her. What it looked like someone had gotten into their apartment and cut the throats on their teddy bears. And it's all a diversion game. It's a control thing for him to keep her under control.
So do you think that Fritz was the mastermind, or that Susie was, or they were just equal in all ways?
I think they played into each other. I think Susie planted the seed, and in Fritz's bizarre, strange mind, he carried out the acts. Susie was a very bitter person. She hated Delores Lynch with a passion because Delores Lynch afforded Tom the monetary means to fight her on the boys. Her father had finally agreed to testify at the child custody hearing against Susie so Tom could take full custody of the boys. That was the death warrant for him. And her mother and her grandma were just in the way for Fritz. Were just in the way. Lieutenant Davison and Alan Gentry and I interviewed Fritz's mother, who was very matter of fact about Fritz. And she looked at me and she goes, young man, if my son wanted you dead, you would have been dead in that intersection. Crack shot. And I looked right at that woman and I said, well, I'll tell you what, there's a difference between shooting a paper target and someone who shoots back. And I shot back. That made me so mad.
Mhm.
But she gave us some information that really helped. She said that Fritz did a lot of trading and hung out at this gun store called McHarg's Gun Store in North Carolina. We went to McHarg's Gun Store. They were part of this, which now y'all would call a sovereign citizen movement. Back then we called it Posse Comitatus.
Sure.
And they weren't the most cooperative. Matter of fact, they were a little hostile. And the son of the owner told me, he goes, "You all frame this man. This man was a Vietnam vet. This man worked for the Central Intelligence Agency. This man survived the jungles of Vietnam, and you people took him out." I looked at him and I said, "Number one, I'm a Vietnam era vet. Fritz isn't old enough to have been in Vietnam."
Right.
I said, "Number two, he wasn't a CIA agent. He was a flunky medical student dropout who lived in a fantasy world."
Mhm.
So they said, "Well, he did sell a weapon back to us, and it was an AR-15, but we don't have it anymore. We sold it, and we had the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, traced the weapon down, found the new owners. The new owner said, 'Sure, you can test the weapon.' And we brought the weapon in, compared the weapon to our recovered bullets, and it was a perfect match. So we found our killer, we found our murder weapon, and the case was solved. It was just one of those bizarre things."
But nobody ever was held accountable for the Lynch murders, correct? Like,
No, because the perpetrator of the Lynch murders were dead.
so
What we did do, we convened a grand jury, and Mr. Bruce Hamilton was the Commonwealth Attorney at the time, and we presented all of our evidence to the grand jury, and the grand jury came to the conclusion that Susie and Fritz were responsible for the murders of Delores and Jane Lynch. So we did wrap it up in that respect. Because I was a new detective, it put me on a different level than I would have ever been. I got years and years of experience in one major case investigation.
Right.
I bet. Oh my gosh.
Before you ask your next one, Candy, I want to back up for just a second. I have a curiosity question. When you, those people who believed that Fritz was all of these things, like he's a Vietnam vet, he's this and that, and you presented them with the truth, how did they react? Did they accept it or did they still believe Fritz?
They still believe Fritz. No, no. Because they had a relationship with him. They didn't know who I was. I was just some cop from Kentucky.
Okay.
No, they didn't believe me. No. Fritz had such a strange background. He lived in a fantasy world. He literally lived in a fantasy world. He made his world up. And his parents kept feeding him the money to keep doing what he was doing.
Curiosity question for me. Listening to you tell your firsthand experience with this case has just been fascinating. I'm going to tell you, I am just so engrossed in this. But based on what I read, and absolutely no disrespect to Mr. Bledsoe, because I can just imagine the amount of research and work that went into all of his reporting and then the book. I mean, just a fabulous job. But I noticed there are some discrepancies. Some of the details are different from your recollection versus the book. For
We
example,
got some things.
yeah. So tell me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall that in the book it said Susie was sitting on the bomb, whereas I don't recall that detail about him trying to throw it out and use it defensively. So what is your opinion about the amount of accuracy that was recorded versus your recollections?
Well, he only knows what he's told.
Sure.
He did sit down and interview us, but we didn't tell him everything. And it's and these are direct. What I told you was a direct statement from Lieutenant Dan Davison, who was an eyewitness account. And Dan just didn't tell him,
So you
and I didn't tell him because I wasn't there.
Right. So do you guys think then that the bomb that blew up the truck, it was not they weren't committing suicide, they were trying to use it on you all and then it just didn't get thrown out the window and that's what blew it up?
That's the opinion of Lieutenant Davison.
Okay.
He saw rapid movement in the truck twice.
Okay.
And we believe the first rapid movements they saw were the execution of the children.
Yeah.
Why would they have killed the children if they weren't intending, like if they were intending to continue fighting till the very end? I wonder why they would have done that.
I don't know. And I don't know if he had more than one device in there. I don't know.
If it could be even more horrible, that's even more horrible. They just did it.
It's in Susie's mind. Tom Lynch was not going to get those kids. She would rather kill him than let him get the kids.
I got the definite impression that there was an emotional attachment as much as she wanted, and she wanted to use them as pawns. She viewed them as pawns in her control game. Do you feel
Yes.
like that's accurate?
Well, more like property.
Mm,
They were hers.
mm,
Period. She had a dire passion. You don't tell Susie she's wrong,
mm-hmm,
and you tell her she's wrong, she becomes an instant enemy.
mm.
And Tom's mother saw right through it, and probably, according to Tom, Delores and Susie just were oil and water from the very get go. They just didn't mix.
So, in terms of firsthand interviews, you definitely were up close and personal with a lot of different people in this story, but the only one you actually got to speak with was Tom. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, because the other Susie and Fritz, that was in the midst of the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department homicide investigation.
Right.
They allowed me to observe, but who's to say I wouldn't have went in there and said something wrong
Mm-hmm,
and screwed something up?
mm-hmm.
So if there was going to be a screw up, it was going to be on their part.
Right.
And I will say that the takedown of Fritz Klenner was an absolute cluster. It was Keystone Cops.
Mm.
It was absolutely infuriating to watch this and then get drawn into the middle of it.
I can imagine. I mean, you, I'm a bit, I don't know what the word is. I admire it at the same time that I'm a little astonished how you could chuckle and be so calm as an Uzi was being directed at you. Do you think, like, what were your feelings? Was there any actual fear, or was it more like, this is so shocking and the adrenaline is rushing, I'm just going to get through this?
No, what I thought was my mind was I'm going to make myself as small as possible. No, and I say I chuckled. There's this, they call it morbid humor in law enforcement and fire departments, where under a stress and strain like that, your mind goes to a different place.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just the reaction of that woman, that poor woman. She was just absolutely terrified, and I'm sitting there looking at her thinking, "My God, what are we doing to this poor lady?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Totally innocent.
Yeah.
Several vehicles in that intersection took rounds from that man.
So fortunate
And
there weren't, because there weren't any fatalities, right? Other than, I mean, beyond the family.
yeah, no. The officer that the bulletproof vest protected him.
Mm-hmm.
He got some bruising. It psychologically damaged him, and he resigned from the police department.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of thrown into a beehive
Mm-hmm.
and didn't know what was going on. Had no idea he was gonna get shot.
Mm-hmm.
No idea. He didn't know anything.
Mm-hmm.
But that's really the life of a policeman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't know.
That reminds me of a question we wanted to ask you. Jerry Bledsoe has said that he still dreams about this case, that it was so bizarre and so affecting that years later he would still sometimes dream about it. Has it had any lasting impact on you?
No, I've never thought about it. I've never dreamed about it. I've never worried over it. No, and I'm not built that way. Some people have PTSD. Some people don't.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of those things in life. It happened, rolled on, went forward, did other things.
Mm-hmm.
It To me, it was a great learning experience. I got to be around great people. I learned a lot that I used the rest of my 30-year career.
Mm-hmm.
I was pretty much in investigation my entire time from then on as a police officer. And when I retired, I was a private investigator for 15 years.
Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
I did arson fraud work for insurance companies across Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, and Tennessee,
Well,
and Kentucky,
fascinating. Fascinating.
living out of a suitcase.
That's fun. A lot of the times when Candy and I talk about true crime cases on our podcast, we try not to just talk about the titillation of it, but we try to say, what can we learn from this? What can we learn as humans about this behavior, that if something occurs in our own life, we could recognize it and avoid something like this from happening? Do you think there are any lessons from this that people can take home with them?
I will tell you that an investigation is only as good as the information provided.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a police officer, when you think something is inconsequential or unimportant, it may be very important for
Mhm.
us. Had Tom Lynch been more forthcoming about his battles with Susie Lynch back and forth,
Yeah.
about the child abuse allegations in Arizona, we would have been more focused on Susie.
Mhm.
But he didn't equate the two. And because he didn't equate it, he didn't spur our interest in it.
Mhm.
So police are only as good as the information they receive. So my lesson in that is, and I would tell people, if you know something, say something.
Mm,
Yeah.
that's
And
good.
I would guess also that in cases for people with personalities such as Tom's that are more gullible and trusting, to just, I don't know, how do you say not be that way, but just to kind of open your eyes a little bit and recognize that there are bad people. I mean, you have a career in proving that there are bad people out there, you know?
Ian Park
I don't know.
too.
Ian Perkins, I actually met a lawyer here in Louisville that was Ian's roommate during that time.
Really.
Really?
Yes, and he remembered it very well. And I can't remember the attorney's name now. I got his face in my mind, but I cannot remember his name.
I felt sorry
And he
for
goes,
Ian.
I felt sorry for him too. I really
"No,
did.
don't, don't feel sorry for
So don't
Ian.
feel
Ian was going to participate. Ian willingly was going to participate in the murder of an individual. The only difference was is he didn't know it was a grandma and a husband and wife. He thought it was a drug dealer, and he was fully willing to help Fritz execute a drug dealer.
Mm. Mhm.
So, now, I don't feel sorry for him. I don't at all. Anybody that's stupid
Mm.
deserves what they got. I mean, that's the one. That's the one takeaway. Did it ruin Ian's life? I suppose by now he's moved on and gotten over it. But no, he was more than willing to help Fritz Klenner kill someone. He didn't know if it was a drug person. He didn't know who it was, but he darn well was going to help that man execute somebody.
Mm.
a good point.
That is a good point.
So
When you and I spoke the other day to set up this interview, you mentioned that even today, I mean, even in recent days, you will still run across somebody who's reading Bitter Blood, or you will be recognized for your involvement in this case. It's just one, I mean, it's 40 years. We started by saying it's been 40 years. Why do you think that is?
it's a captivating story. I mean, it is so bizarre. This case took so many twists and turns. I attribute it to Jerry Bledsoe. He did a great job in the book. He got some things wrong, but very small things. And I had my book with me. I could point every one of them out. And I had all the notes, but like I said, I didn't think we'd be doing this again. It's been 40 years. But Jerry did a great job. And I remember sitting down and being interviewed by Jerry. And I took issue with him when I got the book. I said, Jerry, you called me cockingly confident.
I noticed that. I saw that.
I said, it's not that I was cockingly confident. I'll be darned if I'm going to start my first murder investigation thinking I'm not going to solve it.
Yeah.
And I said, so that's a defeatist attitude. If I would have went in there and said, oh, this is going to be hard. I'm never going to make this case. I said, then I would have never made it.
I like it
And
though.
he
You,
goes,
you said that you had those conversations with him. How much did you actually get to work with him? Was it just one or two little interviews, or was this an ongoing thing?
no, just a couple of interviews. He sat down and interviewed Sherman and I. Yeah, I told Jerry I took issues with you. I said, Jerry, you made Dan Davison the star of your book, and I said, I just want to tell you that Dan sat in the office for a year while Sherman and I did all the legwork. We reported back to the boss, but me and Sherman did all the work. And Dan came with us for the glory of the arrest. So, nothing against Dan. I mean, he did direct us, and Dan's a great man. If you would have ever met the guy, he was from Eastern Kentucky and had this mountain draw, and he talked methodical and kind of slow. And you would have thought, well, this isn't the brightest light in the chandelier. But Dan was a brilliant man, and his thought process. So we used his brain to get us organized and get us in the order of how the investigation was going. And then Dan reviewed everything and said, I think we need to go back and pick back up on this interview and carry it further. We need to take a look at this person. And so Dan led it in that regard, but the field work was done with Sherman and I, because I remember Sherman and I were we were drinking a beer after everything was done and said, and Sherman goes, I read the book. I said, so did I. And he goes, we weren't even there. I, I know.
Can I tell you? Can I tell you? Like, this is the most serendipitous thing. We were so excited when we learned that you would speak with us. So graciously agreed to do this interview. But I was coming at it from the perspective of, oh, I know he was at the murder scene in the beginning, and I know he was shot during this police chase. These are two really key significant events. We're going to hear so much about those two things. And then to find out your level of involvement throughout this entire investigation, it has been fascinating. It's been really interesting to get to hear you share it with us. So thank you for that. I know our listeners are going to find this just as fascinating as Ashley and I did. So many thanks.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Oh my gosh, Ashley, what did you think about that?
That was so much more information than we were anticipating going into this. And I could see the questions in front of me. And I know that you and I were both like, you know what? Forget the questions. Let's just
Yes.
talk and let's see where this goes and just have a conversation or just mostly listen because that was incredible.
It was incredible. And we said it to Lynn. I'll say it again. All credit to Jerry Bledsoe. He did a fantastic job. But I did come out of my research without a clear understanding of just how involved Lynn Nobles was in this. And so as he was starting to tell his firsthand account, I was just I mean, I was shocked. He was just in this and he had so many interesting insights and details to share with us that it was just like, let him go.
Right.
So,
I think the most shocking revelation to me was the fact that when the car blew up, it was not intended to be a suicide, that they were, in fact,
mhm,
according to the assumption of the detective, that they were going to, that Fritz was going to throw the bomb out of the window to deal with it.
mhm. He was
And
going to keep fighting.
and that the children were just collateral, just we don't just like he said objects almost. Also, I was surprised at how much more agency and authority Fritz had because I re-listened to our Bitter Blood before we did this, and my impressions of him based on the information you were giving me was that Susie was really the one, the mastermind, and he kind of helped me understand that they were just two terribly toxic, awful people that were feeding off of each other, and they probably were more equals in this than I had first thought about. What do you
Mm.
think?
I think I understood how scary Fritz was. And I think that even before, I definitely saw the potential for him to brainwash her and to bring her into his delusional world. I still maintain that Susie she came in with her own,
Yeah, oh
I
yeah.
hate to use this word. She came in with her own vendetta and her own agenda. She was going to keep those boys away from
Yeah,
Tom. She was going to use them in whatever way she wanted to use them. I mean, like, so what I saw, I think he helped me to understand just how toxic they were together, just how, but I do agree with you. I think I do see Fritz taking her paranoia and her control issues and using them in some way. Like he took that and that gave him more power to manipulate and feed into things. So yeah, I think he helped. I think Lynn helped me to understand it at a different level. He affirmed some of the things I already thought, but he also, I agree with you. I think I now see Fritz slightly differently.
yeah.
The other thing, over and over again, it was just this thought in the back of my mind that said, how interesting to hear the perspective of somebody who was there living through it, because I had so much empathy and sympathy for Ian,
Oh,
and it was interesting to hear his take. And when, Tom, he was a very sympathetic character. He still is to me. He's still a very sympathetic, person in my mind. But it was interesting to hear Lynn's perspective about just some of these different people that I knew only in one way.
agreed. Well, I am so glad that you set this up. This was fascinating.
Amazing, amazing. Thank you to my friend Tammy. Tammy is Lynn's niece. Thank you for Tammy for reaching out to Lynn, and just thank you, Mr. Lynn Nobles, for talking with us.
Big cheers.
Cheers to you. Yes.
If you love what we do, please rate and review our show. Or you can become a supporter by making a donation through buymeacoffee.com/scandalwaterpod. Whether a single gift or a recurring monthly donation, it would go a long way towards supporting our work and allowing us to keep the tea brewing.
At our website, www.scandalwaterpodcast.com, you can submit questions or your own story ideas, access our sources and show notes, see the merch we offer for sale, and more. You can join the Scandal Water community through our Scandal Water Podcast Facebook page or follow us on Instagram or TikTok at Scandal Water Podcast.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown.
That's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music, Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.